Hello students, today I'm going to be teaching you about the anatomy of the scapula bone. Let's get started. So here is the scapula bone. This scapula bone tends to be a little bit tricky in that it looks similar on the back than it does compared to the front. And also it's on the back of the body, and so a lot of times we kind of forget it's back there. So in your notes, we're going to be working on the right scapula anterior view, and then we'll transition to the other views as well. And we'll be concentrating on these components first. So the first thing I want to do is draw in a compass, and so we can have our directions. And a lot of times you're not going to get the reference of the clavicle or the reference of the humerus, and so you have to get used to looking at the scapula and understanding which side you're looking at it from, where the front is, where the back is, etc. So if we put in our compass for this picture right here, what we would do is we can do the up-down direction in one of two ways. We can do superior, because we have a clavicle and a scapula, and inferior, but when it comes time for us to look at the humerus, we'll transition from superior and inferior to just proximal and distal because of that limb relationship. So from here, because we're looking at the right side of the body, we're not going to do right and left. We're going to go to lateral and medial there. Okay, so that applies to this picture here, and you can see in the anatomy app that makes sense. Here's the midline, so this portion is more medial, lateral is over here, superior, inferior down towards the feet. Okay. Two of the first things that are listed in your word bank over here, medial border and lateral border, those should be relatively self-explanatory. It's the edges of the scapula that are medial versus lateral. And I'm going to give you the alternative names for those as well. Sometimes the medial border, this green side, is known as the vertebral border because it borders the vertebral column. And then likewise the lateral border out here by the armpit is sometimes called the axillary border, and axillary we know means armpit. So those are alternative names for those two boundaries of the edges of the bone. We also have what's called the superior border and then an inferior angle, because there's not really a long edge on the inferior side. So superior border is going to be along here, and the inferior angle is going to be this point at the bottom. I'm going to kind of accentuate the pointiness of that. All right, so those are your four main sides or boundaries of the bone. Let's go ahead and transition those same ones to this posterior view. And before we do that, I'm going to add in another compass. What we've done in this worksheet is take this bone and flip it over to a back view here. So I'll show you what that looks like. We're taking this view, without the ribs of course, and flipping it over towards the back view. So we're still looking at the right scapula. So if we were to make a compass, it would look like superior, inferior, and the only thing that would flip is the lateral and medial, because here's the arm, now we know that's lateral, and the other side would be medial. So use those to do your boundaries. So I'm going to go ahead and transition my labels over to this image. Okay, I've transitioned those over, so you can see medial border, lateral border, superior border, inferior angle. Okay, so we've taken care of all of our boundaries. The next thing that we're going to look at on the scapula is the very, very important spine of the scapula. So I'm going to use a bold color on that. The spine I'm going to make red. It is one of the most prominent features of the scapula, and it's what I want you to, one of the top two things I want you to look for as soon as you pick up a scapula bone, is to find the spine of the scapula. And so that spine is a sharp, slender projection, and for a scapula, it's going to reach this distance. Now, when I get here, about there, the spine changes direction and it becomes a different projection. One of the processes. So take your color up to this point. Extremely prominent ridge. Notice it is on the posterior surface of the scapula. So the spine is always on the back. You can remember that easily because your spine, the word spine, makes you think towards the back. So spine is on the back. We can see a snippet of it here from the anterior view. And color just that little snippet. But it's a posterior feature, and that's a really, really important idea. Posterior feature. So I'll show you in the atlas. The spine is here. Okay, now it's kind of hard to tell where it stops because it just looks like it keeps going over there. But as I tip, let me get rid of my pen. As I tip this guy, you can see that the spine kind of changes angle right here, and so we would cut the spine off there and let this be its own projection. And in our bodies, it's a pretty sharp angle. So you can see it's on the posterior side. And really, we don't get to see much of it from the front, maybe a teeny little snippet there. So let's continue. The spine is a posterior feature. Very important to note that. I guess I'm going to add it up here. Ugh. I'm struggling. There we go. Okay. From there, we're going to go ahead and identify a couple of important fossas. And as we have already learned, a fossa is a shallow ditch or trench. That's what the fossa means. I refer to it affectionately as a scoopy spot. And you can see we have one here called the Glenoid Fossa, Supraspinous Fossa, Infraspinous Fossa, and Subscapular Fossa. So let's take a look at all those fossa words. So we have two fossas, one on either side of the spine, one above and one below. And as we transition to the app, we can see that there is a scoopy spot there above the spine, and then a much shallower sort of scoopy spot on below the spine. You can see it over here as well. Below the spine, above the spine. And so those words are named very, in my opinion, obviously. The supraspinous fossa is going to be the shallow depression or ditch or trench above the spine of the scapula. So let me find another color. Supraspinous fossa. That's going to be this region right here. Supraspinous fossa. Okay, so the name tells you exactly where it is if you just pay attention to what the word tells you. That would make the infraspinous fossa down here underneath. Infra for inferior, spinous referencing the spine, and fossa, shallow ditch. This one's exceptionally shallow. So this whole section here, infraspinous fossa. I'm going to save some time and do it like that. Okay. Now, what a lot of people tend to do is to mistake the infraspinous fossa below the spine for this side. And so I would caution you, that's why we look for the spine first, and then go ahead and immediately label, once we find the spine, supraspinous fossa and infraspinous fossa. And then that leaves the anterior surface alone, because there's no spine here, so there's nothing above and below the spine because it's not even over here. So then when we are going to look, let's see if we can make sense of this. If we were to look under the scapula, like to lift it up and look underneath, really to its anterior surface, we see the fossa under the scapula on its anterior side. And that is the, move my page, here we go. This is the subscapular fossa because it's under, or really on the anterior side is what they're trying to say. Subscapular fossa. Now all these fossas that I previously mentioned are for muscle attachment. So when we learn the muscles of the scapula, specifically the rotator cuff, they're going to have very similar names to these different fossae of the scapula. So subscapular is on the anterior surface, and then the supra and infraspinous fossas are on the back side. And then we've got 2 processes and 1 more fossa left, and we're done with the scapula. So the processes we know are the sticky outy bony projections, and so they're going to be here and here. Here's our 2 processes, here and here. So what I'm going to add to your notes is that the Acromion process is an extension from the scapular spine. So I'm just going to put that, extends from spine. That's the Acromion process. So that's going to be this piece right here. Find the spine, follow it over. When it makes that forward angle, that piece that reaches forward, and I'll show you why in just a minute, that's the Acromion process, that little chunk that's reaching forward. So here, Acromion process. I have process in parentheses on that because a lot of times people will just call it the Acromion. I think it might be best for you guys, just for learning, to keep calling it the Acromion process, because then you start to wonder, what other processes can I drop? But that's not really the case for a lot of things. So here's the Acromion process as an extension of the scapular spine, and it's reaching anteriorly towards the front of the body. So let's take a look here. This one's not as prominent as I would like to see, but you can kind of tell there, spine of the scapula, and then this piece here would be the Acromion process. That means the other little doodad projection is the Coracoid process. Coracoid process. And it starts here, comes up and out. It looks as if, in the diagram, that it's going to hit the head of the humerus, and it does not. It does not make a joint with anything. It is specifically for muscle attachment. You can see a little better here on the back. It's not attaching to anything in terms of bone. So that is the coracoid, watch your spelling, coracoid process. We've heard of coronoid, now we got coracoid. Lucky. Let me show you that on our app, if I can find it. There we go. Alright, so here we are. Here's the coracoid process, and you can see it reaches out, but it does not form a joint with the humerus. That's this last little shallow depression here. So when you're looking at your scapula, you find the spine, you know that's the back. Then you find these little projections, and those reach out towards the front of your body. It'd be really uncomfortable if we turn this around, because then the spine would be hitting the ribs, and these processes would be sticking out the back of our shoulder, which would be super uncomfortable. So they reach forward, specifically so we can have muscle attachment on the front side of the body, and notice the Acromion process makes a joint with the clavicle here. So I'll put that in your notes as well. We have a couple of joints that we need to mention. Here's the acromion, here's the clavicle, and here is the Acromioclavicular joint. Okay, I went ahead and added that word for you. I'm talking about this connection between these two bony portions. The acromion of the scapula, acromio is referenced there, and the clavicle. So that makes the Acromioclavicular joint there. The last thing we need to talk about in terms of the scapula is called the glenoid fossa, sometimes called the glenoid cavity. We only have one scoopy spot left, the glenoid. I'm looking for one I haven't used before. Let's go dark green. The glenoid fossa, and it's actually best viewed from a completely different picture. It's the socket part for the shoulder joint, so really in most cases it's covered until we come down to this lateral view. So before we add the glenoid, let's get our bearings on this lateral view. We were previously looking at an anterior view of the scapula and then a posterior view of the scapula. However, if I drop the humerus and now highlight scapula, we're looking at a lateral view here. So I dropped his arm off, turned him to the side. If I hide all the others, now we're looking right into the shoulder socket. Let me zoom in. And we get the same thing that we're looking at here on our worksheet. So before we do anything, let's make sure we know what we're looking at. This side, let me get my pen here, good. This side is up, so superior. This side is down. Remember I told you previously these little projections reach forward, one because the clavicle is on the front, it makes a joint with the clavicle, others for chest muscle attachment here. So that makes that direction anterior and posterior. Okay, so this is the front side, this is the back side. All right. And now, finally, the glenoid fossa is the socket for the shoulder joint. Okay, so really we don't get a huge view of it anywhere else. I'm going to go back and add that green. Just here, not on the humerus, just here, not on the humerus. Okay, so if I move the humerus, then I get to see right into that shoulder socket. So I'm actually going to add that next to glenoid fossa as one of the notes. That is the socket for the shoulder joint, the glenoid fossa. While we're here, let's talk about the clavicle real quick because it's got just these two parts that you need to know. And here's the clavicle bone. So I think you might be able to guess which end the acromial end is. That would be this side of the clavicle. So that end of the clavicle, I'll color it as well, is called the acromial end. It is always going to face laterally and make a joint with the acromion process. Okay, so that's the acromial end, and then the other end is the sternal end. Okay, I've gone ahead and added a couple of labels. The acromial end of the clavicle, colored gray. The sternal end of the clavicle, because it faces the sternum, I colored the peach color. And then I also labeled for you the second of three joints. We had a Acromioclavicular joint on this side, and where the clavicle meets the sternum is called the Sternoclavicular joint. We already know that this is the manubrium, it's labeled, and this is the clavicular notch of the manubrium. So the sternal end of the clavicle fits into the clavicular notch of the manubrium. There's a lot going on there, so take it slow. Sternoclavicular joint. This is a superior view of that same bone. So we take it from an anterior view over here to a superior view. I'm going to add these colors on here, same as I did here, and then I'm going to label this last joint. Okay, I've labeled that clavicle superior view. Let's look at it on the app. Let me get my skeleton back here. Here's that clavicle. Here's the sternal end and the acromial end. Of course, named for the fact that the acromion process is right here. This joint between the two bones is the acromioclavicular joint and the sternoclavicular joint. And then finally, if we look at the last joint that's happening here up in the shoulder area, it's between the humerus and the glenoid fossa of the scapula. And so we're going to take those two words, glenoid fossa and humerus, and squish them together. And we get the glenohumeral joint for the junction between the humerus and the scapula. So that's your ball and socket glenohumeral joint. We're going to use that a lot when we get to muscles. So lastly, let's take a look at this little diagram down at the bottom. We have an entirely new view from above. And I'm going to go ahead and put in some labels. Not all of them, but some important labels on this picture and then also some on this picture. Okay, I've added some labels to the diagram. Let's start. Spine of the scapula is here. We know that turns into the acromion process. Remember, this is a view from above, which makes a joint with the acromial end of the clavicle. And over here, it's here, but I kind of covered it. Over here's the coracoid process. That's underneath, no joint being made with that, just for muscle attachment. And then again, if you find the spine, you can find the supraspinous fossa that's closer to us in this view, and infraspinous fossa. Subscapular will be on the anterior surface. I know I'm talking fast. You really got to take some time and digest this information for yourself. I put a few labels on the lateral view. Since this is our socket, our glenoid fossa, and this is the front, the coracoid process is here, the acromion process is here, and because it's a lateral view, this must be the lateral border, and it is. Let's take a quick look at our app before we finish up. Okay, I've tried to mimic what you have on your worksheet. I've got the two clavicles, the two scapulae, the two humerus bones, and then a random thoracic vertebra here. So as I tip to the superior view, it looks a bit like what you have here, except this arm is flexed. But you can see there's the supraspinous fossa above the scapular spine, acromion process, acromial end of clavicle, and here's the humerus, making a joint with the glenoid fossa. So that gives you kind of a view of that. We wouldn't see subscapular until we looked at the front side of the scapula. Okay. So next class, we'll be looking at the anatomy of the humerus. Have a great day.